crowd stood frozen, their eyes locked on the massive lion prowling just a few feet away. No one dared to move, no one dared to breathe, and then the impossible happened. The lion's golden eyes flickered with something beyond recognition, beyond instinct, something deeper. The massive beast let out a low, rumbling sound. Not a growl, not a roar, a purr. And then, in a moment that would leave the world speechless, the lion ran straight toward the man. But this wasn't an attack. It was a homecoming. David had always loved animals, but he never expected to raise a lion cub. It happened by accident. Or maybe it was fate. He had been volunteering at a wildlife rescue center when they found the cub, abandoned and alone, barely clinging to life. His mother had likely been killed by poachers, and without her, the fragile baby wouldn't survive a week. David didn't hesitate. He took the cub in, bottle-fed him, kept him warm, and stayed up through endless nights making sure he survived. He named him Zion. Zion wasn't just any lion. He was curious, affectionate, playful, more like a puppy than a predator. He followed David everywhere, nuzzling into his side, climbing onto his lap even after he had grown far too big for it. David had raised dogs before, but this was different. Zion trusted him completely. And David, he loved that lion like family. But deep down, he knew the truth. Zion wasn't meant to stay. As the months passed, Zion grew. His once small paws became massive. His playful nips turned into powerful bites, and his instincts began to shift. David knew what had to happen. Keeping a lion in captivity, no matter how much they loved each other, wasn't fair to Zion. He was born to roam the wild, to lead a pride, to be what he was meant to be. The decision shattered David's heart. The day of Zion's release, David stood by the transport truck, his hands clenched into fists. Zion sat beside him, unaware that this would be their final moment together. David knelt, pressing his forehead against the lion's. "You're going to be free now," he whispered. "This isn't goodbye, I promise." Zion blinked, as if sensing the weight of the moment. Then, with one final nuzzle, he turned and disappeared into the reserve. David never expected to see him again. But years later, when fate brought them back together, the world would witness a reunion like no other. David never truly moved on from Zion. The lion had been more than just an animal he cared for. He had been a part of his heart, a piece of his soul. Even after Zion was released into the protected reserve, David found himself thinking about him constantly. Did he adapt? Was he thriving? Did he even remember the man who had once raised him? Years passed, and David's life moved forward. He continued working in wildlife conservation, dedicating himself to protecting animals just like Zion. He told himself that he had done the right thing, that Zion was where he belonged. But deep down, there was always a hollow space in his heart that no other experience could fill. Then, one day, he received an unexpected call. The reserve where Zion had been released had been monitoring lion activity in the area, keeping track of prides and their shifting territories. One of the rangers mentioned that a dominant male lion had claimed a vast stretch of land, driving out rivals and protecting his pride with unmatched strength. The lion had been seen patrolling the territory near the outer edges of the reserve, closer to human settlements than usual. David listened with interest, but when the ranger said the lion's name, his breath caught. Zion. It had to be him. David didn't hesitate. He arranged a visit to the reserve, his mind racing with possibilities. Would Zion still be there? Would he even recognize him? The idea seemed impossible. Lions weren't like domesticated pets. They moved on, adapted to their environment, became who they were meant to be. When David arrived at the reserve, the rangers guided him to an observation point where Zion had last been seen. The landscape stretched endlessly before him, golden grass swaying in the afternoon heat. Every part of him wanted to believe that Zion was out there somewhere, but doubt crept in. Then, movement in the distance. A powerful figure emerged from the tall grass, his mane thick and dark, his body radiating strength and confidence. He was no longer the fragile cub David had once cradled in his arms. This was a king, a fully grown lion, his presence commanding respect. David's heart pounded. He took a cautious step forward, his voice barely above a whisper. Zion. The lion's ears twitched. He turned his massive head, golden eyes locking onto David. The moment stretched, charged with an energy that sent chills down David's spine. Then Zion took a step forward. Another. And then he ran. Not with aggression, not as a predator, but as a creature who had just found something familiar. David barely had time to react before Zion reached him. The massive lion reared up slightly, pressing his enormous head into David's chest, knocking the breath out of him. A deep, rumbling purr vibrated through Zion's body, and in that moment David knew. Zion had never forgotten him. David staggered slightly as Zion's immense weight pressed against him, but he didn't care. His arms instinctively wrapped around the lion's thick mane, fingers tangling in the familiar golden fur. The deep, vibrating purr that rumbled from Zion's chest was unmistakable. Recognition, trust, love. Tears blurred David's vision as he buried his face into Zion's mane. He had dreamed of this moment, hoped for it in ways he never admitted to himself. But now that it was happening, it was more overwhelming than he could have ever imagined. Zion hadn't forgotten him. After all these years, all the time apart, their bond was still there. The Rangers stood frozen in shock, watching the massive lion, one of the most powerful predators in the wild, nuzzle into a human with the affection of a house cat. One of them whispered in disbelief, "This is impossible." Another muttered, "I've never seen anything like this in my life." But David wasn't paying attention to them. He was focused solely on Zion, on the way the lion rubbed his massive head against him, on the warmth of his breath, on the sheer miracle of this reunion. Zion had grown into a king, his mane fuller, his muscles stronger, his body scarred from battles only a dominant male could understand. Yet, despite it all, he still knew David. Zion finally took a step back, his golden eyes scanning David's face as if making sure it was really him. His tail flicked once, his ears twitching before he let out a low, breathy huff, the same sound he used to make when he was just a cub curled up beside David at night. David let out a shaky laugh, running a hand down Zion's powerful neck. "You remember, don't you, buddy?" His voice cracked with emotion. "I told you this wasn't goodbye." Zion let out a deep exhale, then did something that sent chills down David's spine. He flopped onto his side. The king of the reserve, the dominant male of his pride, the lion who had fought off rivals and claimed his territory, was exposing his belly, the ultimate sign of trust. David let out a choked breath. Zion wasn't just acknowledging him, he was welcoming him back into his world. Slowly, David knelt beside him, placing a hand on Zion's chest. The lion's heartbeat was strong, steady, powerful. He was exactly where he belonged. And yet, so was David. For what felt like forever, the two simply existed together, man and lion, connected by something deeper than instinct, deeper than time. The Rangers had been right, this was impossible. But sometimes love defies nature. Sometimes it creates its own rules. And as David sat beside the lion he had raised, he knew one thing for certain. This was a bond that would never break. The sun hung low in the sky, casting golden light over the vast savanna as David remained beside Zion, his fingers still buried in the lion's thick mane. It was surreal, impossible even, that after all these years, the cub he had raised had not only survived, but had thrived. And yet, here he was, lying beside David, the way he had so many times before when he was small enough to fit in his arms. The rangers still stood at a distance, murmuring in stunned disbelief. They had worked in wildlife conservation for years, had seen countless lions roam these lands, but never had they witnessed anything like this. A dominant male was supposed to be territorial, to see humans as intruders. But Zion, he had done the exact opposite. David chuckled softly, shaking his head. "You always were different, weren't you?" Zion let out a slow, deep exhale, his massive body stretching out before him. There was no tension, no wariness, just the same unwavering trust he had always shown David. One of the rangers finally stepped forward, cautious but curious. "I don't understand," he murmured. "Lions forget their mothers after just a few months of being separated. And yet he remembers you after all these years." David glanced up, a small knowing smile playing at his lips. "I didn't just raise him. I was his world when he had no one." The ranger nodded slowly, but the amazement in his eyes never faded. They all understood that this was something beyond nature, beyond logic. Zion suddenly lifted his head, ears twitching. His golden eyes flickered toward the distant horizon, scanning the grasslands with an intensity David recognized immediately. Something had caught his attention. Then a sound drifted through the air. A deep, distant roar. David stiffened. Another lion. Zion stood in a single fluid motion, his towering frame casting a long shadow over David. His expression shifted, no longer the affectionate companion but the leader he had become. David felt his heart tighten. This moment, this miracle, had been everything he could have wished for. But now the wild was calling Zion back. David swallowed hard and forced himself to stand. He didn't want to let go again, but this time it was different. This time he knew Zion was where he was meant to be. Zion turned to him, his golden eyes searching David's face. The moment stretched between them, filled with everything they couldn't say. Then, as if understanding that this was farewell, Zion stepped forward one last time, pressing his massive forehead against David's chest. David closed his eyes, feeling the warmth of the lion he had once held as a tiny cub. He whispered, "Be safe, my boy." And just like that, Zion turned and disappeared into the wild. But David knew the truth. No matter how many years passed, Zion would always remember. David stood motionless, watching as Zion's powerful form disappeared into the tall grass. The golden mane that had once fit in the palm of his hand was now vanishing into the wild where he truly belonged. The moment was bittersweet. A silent farewell wrapped in the deepest kind of love. The kind that let go when it was right, even when it hurt. The rangers behind him remained quiet, still trying to process what they had just witnessed. One of them finally spoke, his voice hushed with disbelief. "I've never seen a lion do that before, not in all my years out here." David exhaled slowly, his chest feeling both heavy and full at the same time. "Neither have I," he admitted, his gaze still fixed on the horizon. He wanted to hold on to that last moment, to let it imprint in his memory forever. The warmth of Zion's fur, the deep rumble of his breath, the way he had leaned in as if he truly understood the weight of their connection. A breeze swept through the savannah, rustling the grass in soft waves. David closed his eyes for a brief second, listening to the sounds of the wild, the distant calls of birds, the hum of insects, the faint echoes of the lion's roar from earlier. He felt something settle inside him, something peaceful. Zion wasn't gone. He was simply where he was meant to be. The rangers began packing up, speaking in hushed tones as they reviewed the footage from their cameras. They had captured everything. The way Zion had approached David, the way he had recognized him without hesitation, the way he had trusted him completely despite the years apart. It would be something no one would believe unless they saw it with their own eyes. David finally turned back toward them, his steps slow but steady. His mind was still reeling, but his heart knew one truth. This wasn't the end of their story. Zion had found him once. If the wild allowed it, maybe their paths would cross again. As they drove back to the reserve's headquarters, David stared out the window, his thoughts drifting between past and present. He remembered the tiny cub curled against his chest, the playful paws swatting at his hands, the way Zion had once followed him like a shadow. Now, that same cub had grown into a king, leading his own pride, protecting his land. A part of David ached to stay, to linger just a little longer in the hope of seeing Zion once more. But he knew better. Zion was free, and that was the greatest gift he could have ever given him. As the vehicle rumbled forward, leaving the open plains behind, David smiled to himself. The world might see Zion as just another lion, but to him he would always be so much more. As the vehicle rumbled down the dusty road, David kept his gaze on the fading horizon, knowing Zion was somewhere out there, reclaiming his place in the wild. The wind carried distant sounds of the savannah, and though he could no longer see the lion, he could still feel his presence. There was no sadness, no regret, only an overwhelming sense of gratitude. He had been given something most people would never experience, something that defied logic and nature itself. Zion had not only survived, but had thrived, and he had never forgotten the one who had saved him. The Rangers remained quiet for most of the drive back, each of them still processing what they had witnessed. Every so often, one would glance at David as if searching for an explanation, but there wasn't one. Some bonds simply could not be explained, only felt. As they reached the headquarters, David stepped out of the vehicle and took a deep breath, the smell of earth and grass filling his lungs. The world felt different now. He had spent years wondering if Zion remembered him, if he had made the right choice in letting him go. Now he had his answer. Love, real love, was never forgotten. The footage of their reunion would be studied, shared, and undoubtedly debated by experts around the world. Scientists would try to analyze the psychology behind it, trying to understand how an apex predator could still recognize a human after so many years. But David didn't need research to tell him what he already knew. Zion had never stopped being family. Time, distance, and the wild had changed many things, but not that. That night, as he sat under the vast African sky, he thought about the first time he had held Zion as a tiny cub, his fragile body barely strong enough to lift its own head. He had promised to protect him, to keep him safe, to make sure he had the life he deserved. And now, all these years later, he knew he had kept that promise. Zion had found his place in the world, and somehow, against all odds, so had David. He closed his eyes, listening to the night, and for a moment he swore he could hear Zion's deep, familiar breath beside him. Maybe it was just his mind playing tricks, or maybe, in some way, Zion was saying goodbye. Not a final goodbye, but a promise that their connection would never truly fade. As he prepared to leave the reserve, David smiled to himself. He wasn't walking away empty-handed. He was walking away with something far greater, a memory, a bond, and the knowledge that some loves, no matter how impossible, never die. If this story touched your heart, hit that like button and subscribe for more incredible tales of loyalty, love, and second chances. And tell us in the comments, if you could reunite with one animal from your past, who would it be? Let's share our stories together.